Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's program. Photographer, artist, explorer, inventor, and author Solomon Carvalho's induction into the Jewish American Hall of Fame, a ceremony celebrating Solomon Carvalho by the Jewish American Hall of Fame in partnership with the Combat Antisemitism Movement, the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation, the Jewish Heritage Alliance, and B'nai B'rith International. We're live on Zoom and we'll later have the recording of today's event available on Facebook and YouTube, and are proud to present today the Jewish American Hall of Fame's 2023 inductee, Solomon Carvalho, the renowned late Jewish American photographer. During today's program, we have the opportunity to learn about Carvalho's fascinating life story and his incredible contributions to American culture. My name is Arthur Masarjan, and I serve as the Chief of Staff for the Combat Antisemitism Movement, as well as the Deputy Director of the Jewish American Hall of Fame. CAM is a global coalition of more than 750 partner organizations and millions of people from a diverse array of religious, political, and cultural backgrounds engaged in the common mission of fighting the world's oldest hatred, anti-Semitism. Founded in 2019, CAM has emerged as a leading voice in the collective effort against anti-Semitism and fosters groundbreaking alliances that transcend traditional divides, reaches diverse audiences, and forges relationships with policymakers at the global, national, and local levels. Solomon Carvalho was a truly remarkable man who dedicated his life to contributing to the American Jewish community. Whether it was serving as a board member of the Philadelphia Hebrew Education Society, or helping to found Baltimore's Beth Israel Sephardic Synagogue, or helping to organize the nascent Los Angeles Jewish community, he was wholeheartedly committed to supporting fellow Jewish Americans. Carvalho's devotion to strengthening American Jewish life is all the more important to commemorate as Jewish Americans are facing a rising tide of anti-Semitism today. With anti-Jewish hatred once again entering the mainstream and manifesting on the streets, on our college campuses, and in cities around the world, particularly after the October 7th attacks by Hamas in Israel, it is all the more important to celebrate the very best of the American Jewish community with individuals like Solomon Carvalho. It's for this very reason to fight anti-Semitism by commemorating and celebrating the accomplishments of men and women in various fields and issuing annual medals and mounting the Jewish American Hall of Fame plaques that the Jewish American Hall of Fame was established by my dear cousin Mel Wax at the Judah L. Magnus Museum in Berkeley, California in 1969. Beginning in 2010, the Jewish American Hall of Fame plaques went on permanent exhibit at the Virginia Holocaust Museum in Richmond, Virginia. And in 2019, the Jewish American Hall of Fame medal collection was established at the Cincinnati Skirball Museum, located on the campus of Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. Now, to discuss the Sephardic Jews featured in the Jewish American Hall of Fame, it's my great privilege to introduce the founder of the Jewish American Hall of Fame, Mel Wax. In addition to founding and leading the Jewish American Hall of Fame, Mel was president of the American Israel Numismatic Association for 18 years and has been a member of its board of directors for more than 50 years. He's also author of Medals of the Jewish American Hall of Fame, 1969 to 2019, and Who's Who in the Jewish American Hall of Fame. And it's really incredible the work that Mel has done for more than half a century now to celebrate the contributions of Jewish Americans by building the Jewish American Hall of Fame and founding it and issuing these commemorative medals every year. So thank you, Mel. Your work is really something to be proud of and is more important than ever.
Thank you, Arthur. Appreciate that. I want to dedicate today's program to the Israeli martyrs, the hostages, and the Israelis who are fighting Hamas. Also, to Paul Kessler, who was killed at a pro-Israel rally held not too far from where I live. I want to thank the Combat Antisemitism Movement for their support of today's Jewish American Hall of Fame induction ceremony, and Arthur Masarjan, who is Chief Staff and Director of International Affairs at CAM, as well as Derek Tesson of CAM's International Affairs Research and Engagement Department, for their help in organizing this induction ceremony. And finally, I want to thank my grandson, Landon Spencer, who helps me with technical aspects. Now I will talk briefly about the Sephardi Americans who are in the Jewish American Hall of Fame. Oh, Landon, can you set up the PowerPoint? Where's it's okay? It's here, and then go to the PowerPoint. Oh, did you see it?
Okay, great. I think Derek has begun sharing the presentation,
Thank you. And how to, okay.
so you can just prompt him when to go to the next slide.
Okay. Louis de Sant'Angelo was the finance minister to, I'm sorry. Don Isaac Abravanel was a biblical scholar, philosopher, and statesman who helped finance Columbus's voyage. And by the way, it was Spanish jewelry, not Queen Isabella's jewelry, that paid for the voyage. Louis de Sant'Angelo was finance minister to Ferdinand and Isabella, and he was also a major supporter of the trip. Abraham Zacuto was an astronomer and rabbi, and his astronomical tables were used by Columbus, including his prediction of a solar eclipse, which supposedly saved Columbus's life in amongst the natives. Louis de Torres was the only known Jew on Columbus's voyage. He was one of 39 men left behind on a Caribbean island, which is either Hispaniola or Cuba, we don't know. Sadly, when Columbus returned to the island later that year, he found that the group had been wiped out. "23 Sephardi Jews landed in New Amsterdam from Brazil in 1654. A few weeks earlier, Asser Levy and 2 other Ashkenazi Jews had arrived from Holland. The Spanish-Portuguese synagogue was built on Mill Lane in 1730. That's in Lower Manhattan. The Touro Synagogue is the oldest standing synagogue in the United States. Located in Newport, Rhode Island, George Washington wrote to the congregation, quote, "The United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance." Chaim Solomon was born in Leszno, Poland, to a Sephardic Jewish family descended from Spanish and Portuguese Jews who gradually migrated to Poland following Ferdinand and Isabella's expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. Chaim Solomon helped to finance the American Revolution. Statius was rabbi of the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in New York. When the British conquered New York City in late August 1776, he left with some of his congregants to Philadelphia. Though 3 of his grandparents were Ashkenazi, Noah stressed his Sephardic identity. In 1825, Noah attempted to establish a Jewish homeland near Buffalo, New York, but this was unsuccessful. He served as sheriff in New York, as consul to the Kingdom of Tunis, and as a Jewish community leader. The man of the hour, Solomon Carvalho, was the official photographer on the 5th Fremont Expedition that attempted to prove that a central route near the 38th parallel would be the best path for a planned transcontinental railroad. He was also an artist, author, and inventor. Emma Lazarus contributed a sonnet, "The New Colossus," to raise money for the Statue of Liberty's pedestal. It contained these immortal words: "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." Dara Torres competed in 5 Olympics, winning a total of 12 medals, 4 gold, 4 silver, and 4 bronze in 1988, 1992, 2000, and 2008. In 2008, she was the oldest ever Olympic swimmer at the age of 42. I invite all of you to visit our website, amuseum.org, and if anybody's interested in medals, write to me, director JAHF@yahoo.com, and I'll send you information. Thank you very much. Glad you could come. Okay, Derek.
Thank you very much, Mel, for that presentation, and for your 50 years of dedication to the Jewish American Hall of Fame and the fight against anti-Semitism. This work is more important than ever before. Derek, could you remove the slideshow, please? Now, to provide introductory remarks for today's ceremony, it's my pleasure to introduce a pre-recorded message from Gemma Birnbaum, Executive Director of the American Jewish Historical Society. Prior to joining AJHS, she was Associate Vice President for Media and Education at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans and an educator with Haifa International.
Hello, I'm Gemma Birnbaum. I'm the Executive Director of the American Jewish Historical Society here in New York City. AJHS has been the proud parent organization of the Jewish American Hall of Fame since 2001. This year's honoree, Solomon Carvalho, was an artist, an explorer, an inventor, and a photographer, creating innovative works that both exemplify and were ahead of his time. I encourage everyone to go to the Loeb Portrait database at loebjewishportraits.com to view Carvalho's self-portrait, as well as a portrait he painted of his wife Sarah, which are housed by our good friends at the Yeshiva University Museum. Thank you to all for tuning in today to learn more about the life and legacy of this great Jewish American, to Mel Wax and the Jewish American Hall of Fame, and to all partners for this program, Combat Antisemitism Movement, the American Sephardi Federation, the Jewish Heritage Alliance, and the B'nai B'rith Alliance. Thank you so much for including me and AJHS in today's program.
Next on our program, we have Sam Asher. Sam joined the Virginia Holocaust Museum as Executive Director in 2018. He came to the museum from his position as CEO of the Jewish Community Federation of Richmond, where he had served since 2010. He's a native of Detroit and a University of Michigan graduate. He also holds a dual master's degree in social work and community planning from the University of Maryland and Jewish history from the Baltimore Hebrew University. I'd also be remiss without mentioning the leadership of the Jewish community in Richmond in celebrating Jewish American heritage. This past week, it was my pleasure to bestow on behalf of CAM our Civic Leadership Award on Richmond Mayor LeVar Stoney at our Mayor Summit Against Anti-Semitism in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, to thank Mayor Stoney for his leadership in leading 130 American cities to celebrate Jewish American Heritage Month for the first time last year, and we were honored to have the JCRC of Richmond represented at that event as well. So Sam, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your community's leadership, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Mel, Mazel Tov. You've done an amazing job. For everyone on this Zoom call, thank you for all of your hard work. I must tell you that I was at the rally in Washington. Richmond sent 7 buses from Richmond to DC, and it was quite something to see the Jews from America come all the way from the Washington Monument all the way up to the Capitol. We made a statement, most importantly, that we stand behind Israel in this terrible, terrible time. And we will continue to do so. We had many politicians there. It was very important that we make a statement with them and for them, and continue our support, and to say, Am Yisrael Chai. There are thousands of students and teachers and many from the general public who are able to see the Jewish American Hall of Fame, the fantastic medals that we have on display at the museum. If you can put up the first slide. Mel, I don't know if you have it or Derek has it. Oh, all right, go to the other. I was trying to get Carvalho. There you go. So there's Solomon Carvalho, who is now at the front of all of the entire 50 slides, 51 slides that we have from the Jewish American Hall of Fame. You've all heard the history of this fantastic photographer and a person who led the expedition to find the best path planned for the Transcontinental Railway. This is an amazing person. He sits at the head of all of the exhibit at this moment, as this is where we place all of the new inductees. So we're very proud to have that. And if you can come up with the second slide now, Derek, thank you. So the second slide begins, as you see on the left, the first medal is Commodore Uriah Levy, who made sure that Monticello is part of our state of Virginia and was left eventually to the state of Virginia. So thousands and thousands of people see Monticello and are able to walk through the estate. We are so pleased to be able to have these amazing medals and this amazing history as part of the Virginia Holocaust Museum. I want you to also know that in February, I'll be teaching a class at the University of Richmond on the Jewish American Hall of Fame. It's just incredibly important that people see the benefit of what our Jewish American heroes, as I call them, gave to the United States, gave to our country, and helped to build the fabric of America. I can't thank you all enough for all of your hard work, and I want you to know that the museum does its best to continue this story, and I will continue to be a real supporter as the years go on. And thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Sam, so much for that presentation and for your partnership with the Jewish American Hall of Fame all these years, and for your service to the Virginia Holocaust Museum and the Jewish community in Virginia writ large. Thank you. Now we turn to reflections on Sephardic American Jewish history that can help provide some background information for today's honoree. Here today to provide this overview is David Dangor, who has served as president of the American Sephardi Federation since 2003. And at CAM and Jewish American Hall of Fame, we're very grateful to have the American Sephardi Federation as strong partners, and have worked very closely with Jason Guberman and the whole team over there for many years. So thank you to the American Sephardi Federation. David is also a businessman who's currently vice chairman of BioGea, a public Swedish biotech company. Born in Tehran to an Iraqi Jewish father and an Austrian mother, his great-grandfather was the chief rabbi in Baghdad during Ottoman rule. But David, thank you for joining us today. David, I think you might be on mute.
Sorry, I thought you were going to unmute myself. Oh,
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you. We can hear you now.
Okay. First of all, thank you for asking me to say a few words. I now realize after listening to the opening remarks here that you know a lot about Sephardic Jewish history, all of you, which makes me humble in speaking because I'm not an historian. So I can only give you my reflections after being involved with the American Sephardi Federation for 20 years. What has struck me is how little that is known by the public at large, but also by Jews, the Jewish community in this country, about American Sephardic Jewish history. And I think what you are doing is extremely important with the Jewish Hall of Fame. And I'm so glad to see so many Sephardic heroes being inducted or having been inducted. You know, it's a strange time we're living in, and you all made some alluded to that. But what I can say from my perspective is I feel like anti-Semitism has always been around in this country. And because of the anti-Semitism, I think many contributions to American Jewish history and American history has been omitted because of anti-Semitism, not wanting to give Jews their due credit. And today's inductee is a great example for me, because until you highlighted him, I had not known about him, which made me embarrassed. But I don't only attribute anti-Semitic historians to the lack of records of early Jewish contributions. I also find that in modern times, also the Jewish historians, or let's put it this way, the Jewish filmmakers, for example, the 350th anniversary of Jewish history in this country, are focusing on the wrong starting date of American Jewish history. They all like to start with 1654 and the arrival of the 23 Portuguese Jews from Recife in Brazil as a starting point, but then sort of they gloss over the Sephardic Jewish history, and it gets into the fantastic contributions that the European and Eastern European and the German Jews made that arrived in the mid-1800s primarily. But I also think there's maybe one more reason, and this is a little bit sort of controversial on purpose, that the early Jewish contributions have been neglected, and that is what I call the early passing of Alexander Hamilton. I mean, until recently, this great and very important founding father was neglected in history, in what I'll call common history, and only with the show on Broadway did he come alive again. What is not known by many, and I don't know if I'm telling you stories that you already know, but Alexander Hamilton was strongly influenced by a Sephardic Jewish background. I don't know if you know that his mother, Rachel, who supposedly was half English, half Huguenot, was married to a Danish citizen, a Sephardic Jew, on the island of St. Nevis. There's a lot of controversy about Alexander's background, but his mother, Rachel, was kicked out by her first husband for all sorts of reasons. And she ended up having two illegitimate sons with a Scot, James Hamilton, and one of them being Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was later, when he was growing up, placed in a Sephardic Jewish school. And from what I've seen, the official record seems to be that the Sephardic Jewish school took him in because the Christian schools available on the island would not take in a bastard, as he was not born by the father being married to the mother. But I'll tell you, I don't believe that's true. The fact is, in those days, with the anti-Semitism still very much alive and the Inquisition in full force, it's highly unlikely that a Sephardic Jewish school on the island of St. Nevis would dare take a boy that's not Jewish to become a student, because being accused of proselytizing is something that the Jews in those years were very, very afraid of. Now, why did I just call Alexander Hamilton Jewish? His mother may have converted, nobody knows. But the fact is, he went to a Jewish school. He learned to read and write Hebrew. He could quote the 10 Commandments in Hebrew by heart. And he was a talented young boy that found his way to St. Croix and working for a Dutch trading company under a man called Castro, which is a Sephardic Jewish name, who found him very talented and helped him to get off to New York, where he entered King's College, later Columbia University, and became very quickly involved in the American Revolution. I will get back to Alexander Hamilton in a minute, but I've just set the stage of his strong Sephardic experience and influence, and the fact that it was a well-known fact that Alexander Hamilton was never seen in a church, didn't go to church like all the other founding fathers, and that he was very friendly with Jewish businessmen, and it was not always favorably looked upon. And he also represented a Jewish businessman in a court case, which was frowned upon as well. And uniquely, Alexander Hamilton succeeded and acquitted his client that was accused of some financial dealings. So if Alexander Hamilton would have lived to be older, I think he would have had much more to say about the Sephardi, or about Jews in general, and the positive influence they could have on the country. You alluded in your speech to, in your opening remarks, to Columbus' trip or excursion discovering the Americas. In Sephardic Jewish history, that is really the beginning, because a part of the one identified Jew on his first mission, it's believed that several of his officers on the boat were conversos. And as far as I'm aware, his main navigator was either a converso or the very Jew that you just mentioned earlier. There were rumors that Christopher Columbus may have had some Jewish blood in him, because it's noteworthy that he set off on his excursion, and as you said, paid by Jewish money and not Isabel's jewelry. It's that he left on his excursion on the very day of the beginning of the Inquisition in Spain. The second reason or clue that of his potential background was that when he discovered America, he entered in his logbook the comparison of having found a new country to the Jews finding the promised land after leaving Egypt. And that's in his logbook. Where shall I go from here? You know, looking at Alexander Hamilton's potential influence, it's really remarkable if you look at the founding fathers and their views of the Jews. I don't know if their views of the Jews were influenced by Alexander Hamilton, but their comments about the Jews are remarkable. And I'll start with Alexander Hamilton first. Alexander Hamilton is quoted from a letter saying, "The progress," and I'm quoting, "the progress of the Jews from the earliest history to present time has been and is entirely out of the ordinary course of human affairs. Is it not then a fair conclusion that the cause also is an extraordinary one? In other words, that it is the effect of some greater providential plan?" The next founding father that wrote positively about the Jews was our second president, John Adams. I'm quoting from a letter that he wrote. "I will insist the Hebrews have contributed more to civilized men than any other nation. If I was an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. They are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited this earth. The Romans and their empire were but a bubble in comparison to the Jews. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern. Now, I don't think I've ever read a better summary of and better PR for the Jewish people. Remarkable to come out of a founding father in that day and age when anti-Semitism was still prevalent in the United States, or what to become the United States. You quoted George Washington while he was campaigning with Thomas Jefferson for the passage of Bill of Rights, and the letter that he wrote to the Torah Synagogue, as you mentioned, the oldest standing synagogue in this country, Newport. He wrote, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in the land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit safely under his own wine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." The unique phrase about the wine and the fig tree is a reference to the words of the prophet Micah, prophesizing the messianic utopia. George Washington continued with the phrases like, "To bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance." He added in the letter that tolerance is not the indulgence of one class of people, but the inherent natural rights, as the great Jewish writer and historian Eli Evans wrote. There was one founding father that was accused of being an anti-Semite, namely Benjamin Franklin. But from what I could gather from history, that's probably a ruse, because he was supportive of Jews, and he also gave money to erecting a synagogue. And it's believed today that the letter where he displayed anti-Semitism was probably an engineered letter during the time of World War II and from Nazi sympathizers. You spoke about the induction of Chaim Solomon. It's worth mentioning this Sephardic Jew, although he was born in Poland. He was living and working out of Philadelphia. And when the Revolutionary Army ran out of money and the soldiers was threatening to go on strike, there was an emissary sent to Philadelphia to approach Chaim Solomon and the Jewish congregations in Philadelphia. It's worth noting that although Chaim Solomon was already a famous financier, the Sephardic Jewish congregation in Philadelphia was funded by and supported by the Jewish community in St. Croix. And I always wondered if Alexander Hamilton, who was really George Washington's right-hand man in every single regard, was the one that knew to go and send a message for help from the Jews in Philadelphia. And Chaim Solomon was not alone funding this phase of the Revolutionary Army. Several of the Sephardic Jews that were present there contributed, although Chaim Solomon was the most generous. You mentioned Uriah P. Levy, the biggest landowner and developer at one point in Manhattan, and the first Jewish naval officer in the US. He was an instrumental reformer of the Naval Code of the United States in regard to the conduct and punishment of sailors. And Uriah Levy has to his credit the banning of flogging, which is a remarkable contribution. As a little side story, again, because of anti-Semitism, he tried to become an officer in the Navy for the longest time and was turned down, and wrote to the President of the United States at that time several times. And after, I think, the fourth attempt, he was finally granted officer status. Now, as you notice, I'm just cherry picking a few Sephardic Jewish names of importance, but I can't do that without mentioning somebody that I'm not sure how the American Jewish Hall of Fame would treat. and how he should be looked upon in history. But it's Judah Benjamin, the Jewish Confederate. Judah Benjamin was probably in American history maybe one of the most important players. He was a loyal minister to Jefferson Davis, and he was really Secretary of State. But because of his competence, he became acting Minister of War as well for the South. And when you read about Judah Benjamin, again, a Sephardic Jew of Portuguese origin, there is some proof that he was of two minds with what he was doing, and he allegedly made several attempts with the North to arrange some kind of compromise to get a peace agreement going, and where he was offering up some solutions to slavery. I don't want to go into that at length. But what makes Judah Benjamin also very interesting is that after the Civil War, he was accused of being behind the murder of Lincoln, President Lincoln. And there is nothing to even suggest that that was remotely a possibility. But he was accused. And I would say, after this accusation against him, maybe one of the most vile periods of anti-Semitism broke out in the United States, in the press, with cartoons. And it was really almost what I would call an identical precursor in ugliness to what happened in France with the media and the Dreyfus affair some 40 years later. Interestingly enough, Judah Benjamin fled the United States after the war, got away, and ended up in England and became one of the foremost legal minds in the United Kingdom. And what was unheard of for a Jew, he achieved the bench at the Queen's Bench, and he wrote several books on legal affairs, and his books on commerce and sales are still mandatory reading today when you study to become a lawyer in England. Now back to the revolution, and before I close out, I have to mention Thomas Jefferson, who deservedly is a hero to American Jewry and was at the time. He fervently championed equal political rights for Jews. In 1820, Jefferson wrote, "Religious freedom is the most effectual anodyne against religious dissension." Jefferson told that he was delighted to see American Jews assuming full social rights and hoped they will be seen taking their seats on the benches of science as preparatory to their doing the same at the Board of Government. This was a quote from Jefferson. Jefferson's most notable achievement in establishing religious and civic toleration for American Jewry was his 1779 bill for establishing religious freedom in Virginia. Adopted in 1785, the bill proclaimed, "No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place of ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burthened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise affect their civil capacities." 2 years later, in 1787, the very same sentiments were adopted federally. Now, I've mentioned all this about the founding fathers because either through Alexander Hamilton and or through their experience with Jewry, during their lifetime, the Sephardic Jews were the dominant Jewish presence I believe, in the United States, and they were influenced by them. The Sephardic Jews came to the United States from Spain and Portugal and had not suffered until the Inquisition the terrible conditions that European and German Jewry had with pogroms. They had reached the highest of stations in Spain and Portugal and came and were, what shall I call it, more easily integrated into societies here, I believe. And not only that, but during the 1800s in, for example, New York, several Sephardic Jewish families became part of the highest of society. And one good example, which I think I'm one of the very few that know, or maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know if you're aware of the community called Tuxedo Park, north of New York, that was originally the Lorillard family's hunting grounds, but that they developed for all their friends in society to come and have a house, build a house, and create a gated community. The Tuxedo Club was founded, a very closed elitist club. And I had a chance to look at the records of the founding of the Tuxedo Club in the mid 1880s. And guess what? The founding treasurer was a gentleman called Montefiore Isaacs, a nice Sephardic name. Now, there were two waves of anti-Semitism in the United States. One, what I would call a low-grade anti-Semitism, relatively speaking, during the period leading up to about the 1850s, 1860s. Why to that period? Because that's when the Ashkenazi Jews, the German Eastern European Jews, came in bigger numbers. They were Yiddish speaking. They came from a very miserable life experience, living in ghettos, being severely discriminated against. And it was a bigger challenge for them to become accepted in the American fiber, in the American society, than the Sephardic Jews. And very sadly, the Sephardic Jews, I believe, also looked down upon them and almost felt that they were coming and disturbing what was a relatively comfortable existence for the Jews up until then. This is, of course, oversimplified, but I'll say it was when the Ashkenazi Jews came and began to work their way up and, of course, become immensely successful and maybe even more successful than the Sephardic Jews ever became. This also, I believe, led to a stronger anti-Semitic sentiment in this country. Also because at the same time as these Jews came, many other immigrants came from Europe that also brought with them the European anti-Semitism. So I'll close here. I could go on forever, but as a layman, I hope I haven't embarrassed myself too much trying to give you some context about Sephardic Jewish history in the United States. And I want to give kudos to the Hall of Fame for Jewish Americans. And I look forward to many more Sephardic Jews finding their rightful place there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. It was really, really special to hear your presentation. It's fascinating and it's important history. You know, how impactful the Sephardic American community was and how they really not only helped establish the independence of the United States and contributed so much to its early days, but were the founders of the American Jewish community. It's I was in Charlottesville earlier this year at Monticello, and when you mentioned Jefferson, I was surprised to learn that Commodore Levy and his family had purchased the estate because they thought it was so important to preserve the history because of Jefferson's religious freedom edicts, and he was the first to reach the rank of Commodore as an American Jew in the Navy, and his family took care of the property for, I think, almost a century before the Park Service finally took it over in the early 20th century. And I grew up near Tuxedo Park and did not know that history, so I was really really pleased to learn that as well.
Allow me to mention two more things quickly.
Sure.
Uriah P. Levy and his wife are buried at Monticello. Did you know that?
I saw the tombstones there, yeah.
And I also mentioned to you that when I went into Tuxedo Park, which is close to 30 years ago, a lot of the big mansions were still dilapidated. And on several doors, I could see signs of mezuzahs having been placed on the doors.
Wow.
And yet that became this most famous anti-Semitic haven in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s.
Wow. That's a
Sorry.
incredible history. Yeah. Thank you, David. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing this. It's really, really important. So thank you so much. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Keith Atkinson, who will speak about his familial connection to Solomon Carvalho. And after retiring around 2001 with some time on his hands, Keith decided to do some research into his wife, Nancy's ancestry. Her grandfather, Dr. Ernest French, physician of Jamaica, had married Adele Miriam Carvalho of New York City in 1907. He soon after discovered Adele's father was a famous handwriting expert, and her grandfather was Solomon Carvalho of Fremont's Trans Expedition fame. The Carvalho story was a revelation. It took nearly 10 years to complete, but ultimately led him to trace the heritage back to Charleston, Barbados, London, and Amsterdam, going as far as 1680, when Manuel Nunez Carvalho fled the Portuguese Inquisition in Porto for the Netherlands. As a teenager, Manuel had been interrogated by the Inquisition, but had succeeded in evading a death sentence by recanting and becoming a new Christian. Manuel had been born in Trancaso, a village near the Spanish border. Keith found his family's records there up to 1550 and visited a few years back with other Carvalho descendants, and joined by the mayor, placed a wreath on a family grave. I hope I got that all right. And here to share his family's amazing story of discovery is Keith Atkinson. Thank you, Keith. I think you're on mute still, Keith.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Could you have the first slide, please, Derek? Right, so good evening, everyone, from a wet and wintry London evening. My wife, Nancy, is Solomon's great-great-granddaughter, and she and I are here today to outline his family story, his origins. Here she is with Solomon. Next slide, please. As you can see, the picture of Solomon, famous one, is on my study wall. Next slide. It is likely that the Sephardic Carvalhos originated in Spain, where the Inquisition started in 1490, moving just across the border to Trancoso in Portugal, where they thought they would be safer. Their later travels took them to Amsterdam, London, Barbados, and finally America. Slide. The first member of the Carvalho family we have identified so far is the top figure on the left, Miguel Rodrigues, born in 1535 in Portugal. Unfortunately, this was not great timing, as the Portuguese Inquisition started formally just 1 year later, in 1536. I don't know what's happened here. Something's come on the screen. There we are. Can I have the slide back, please? Okay. So the Miguel's son, Geronimo, had also another son called Francisco Nunes Carvalho. He had 11 children. He was a merchant. He had 11 children, most of whom became targets for the Portuguese Inquisition, being secret or crypto Jews. All 11 were baptized as Catholics. Jews baptized their children as soon as they could to provide some kind of protection if challenged by the Inquisition. Slide. This is a map you can see in the bottom of the page. Salamanca in Spain, lovely old university town just across the border. Trancoso was where the family had moved, and that is where we visited them. We visited a few years back now. It has a charming Jewish museum there, which includes quite a bit of the research that I had done on the Carvalhos. And together with the local mayor, we placed a wreath for the Carvalhos in the cemetery there. Slide. This is the village of Trancoso, walled village. The Inquisition was a terrifying organization, answerable only to the Pope and the Portuguese king. Being found guilty of, quote, heresy, apostasy, and Judaism could mean being burnt at the stake. Francisco's son Manuel, ancestor to our Solomon Carvalho, aged just 13, was arrested, and like many others, he quickly confessed the error of his ways. Sephardic Jews, as well as Muslims, were, if they repented, simply fined all their goods, forcibly baptized as Catholics, or worse. Some, known as conversos or new Christians, never reverted to Judaism, but for others, crypto-Jews, they practiced in secret for generations. We found Manuel's 230-page handwritten trial document among the 40,000 Inquisition records in the Portuguese state archives, and we had it transcribed and then translated from Old Portuguese. It took months and cost hundreds of euros. Each page looks like this. Slide. The terrified Manuel was led into the public square in front of thousands to hear his fate at the auto de fe, or act of faith. As he had voluntarily confessed, he was merely reconciled, his few possessions confiscated by the church, and then in prison he was instructed into the true Catholic Church, much better than the alternative. But Manuel became a successful merchant, and in 1678, aged 27, he married Leonor Rodriguez in Porto, northern Portugal. Slide. It's a lovely old town now on the Douro River. Manuel lived in Rua de Baixo, down in the right-hand corner of your picture, very close to the waterfront. Slide. We found the little back street where the family lived, very convenient for Manuel's shipping activity. This contemporary house you see here on the right could even have been theirs. For the next few years, Manuel and Leonor kept a low profile. They were crypto-Jews. They had 4 children, all baptized Catholics. But in 1689, the Inquisition attacked Manuel again, accusing him of relapse into heresy. Claiming he needed to raise finance abroad to pay off his fines and creditors, he took a ship to Amsterdam, leaving Leonor and his 4 children behind. They were apart for 2 years. In the Amsterdam archives, we were astonished to discover several poignant handwritten letters from Leonor to her husband at this time, i.e. 1690. Next slide. She wrote, "Get me out of this purgatory. Twice the inquisitors have visited me. I have not had answer from my many writings. The children are well." Although we might now struggle to read this, in 1690, for a woman, this will be considered quite an educated hand. Finally, after 2 years, the family joined Manuel, who was now named Abraham. Leonor became Sarah, and their 4 children also took Hebrew names. Excuse me. Frustrated by Manuel's absence in Holland, the Inquisition prosecutors in Portugal had an effigy of him burnt at the stake in 1696. His brother, John, had actually been burnt alive. In Amsterdam, Jews enjoyed religious freedom, and as international traders, contributed significantly to Amsterdam's booming economy. By 1675, the city had a magnificent synagogue. Most Jews lived nearby on Judenbraestraat. Slide. Carvalho's neighbors were mainly Sephardic. The Montaltos at number 1, Rodriguez at number 3, Da Costas and Pintos at 7 and 9, and round the corner at number 4, a few years later, the Rembrandts. In 1705, Abraham and Sarah's eldest son, Isaac, married Judith, a Sephardic girl who had escaped from Madrid. An orphan, she'd won a lottery for a community dowry, but payable only if she found a husband. Fortunately, she found Isaac. He collected the cash. Meanwhile, in London, the Jewish community had built a magnificent new synagogue named Bevis Marks, and in 1708, Isaac Carvalho and Judith, along with many other Jews, emigrated there. Isaac a jeweler in the city. From Judith's will of 1735, written in Portuguese, it seems they were reasonably well off, and the Carvalhos remained in London for nearly a century, continuing to work in semi-precious stones and attending Bevis Marks. Slide. This is Bevis Marks. Isaac's son, Samuel, had a son. He was the first Solomon Carvalho. American historian Bertram Korn wrote, quote, Solomon, despite his modest circumstances, instilled in his children a love of learning and refinement, which went beyond the simple education received in the school of Bevis Marks. Two of his sons demonstrated in both their vocations and associations that they took their father's aspirations well to heart. Sons Emmanuel and David Carvalho, who had studied Hebrew and other languages at Bevis Marks, which had a close connection with the Nida Israel synagogue in Barbados. When in 1799 Nida Israel needed a new Hazan, Bevis Marks suggested Emmanuel. So off he and younger brother David went. Slide. This is where the Bridgetown Jewish community lived. Emmanuel's salary was a pretty low £80 per annum, but a silk gown was purchased for him to officiate. He constantly complained at his inadequate salary and eventually departed in 1808 to Sheriff Israel, New York, and then Charleston, where, quotes, the warm climate would suit him better, the best post on the continent. Slide. In 1812, Emmanuel takes his first service in Charleston. Slide. This slide shows that the Carvalho residence in 29 Hazel Street was just a few hundred yards from the Beth Elohim Synagogue, which was itself close to the main traders' streets of King and Meeting Streets. When in 1812, David Carvalho was nearly 26, and the USA was at war with Great Britain, and David was classified by South Carolina U.S. Marshals Return of Enemy Aliens and POWs as single, 25 years, 10 months, lapidary, enemy alien, no intention to naturalize. But a few months later, he joined the volunteers in the Charleston Merchant Service militia, defending the city against the British, of which at that time he was still one. Slide. This is King Street, Charleston, where David is a resident in King Street as a jeweler and a watchmaker. In 1814, he met and married Sarah Cohen d'Azevedo, 21, daughter of a visiting Hazan from Bevis Marks, and their first son, our hero, Solomon Nunes Carvalho, was born there in 1815. Slide. On the 9th of September 1814, David Carvalho had purchased, quote, for $250, a certain Negro boy named Sandy, sober, honest, and no runaway. A Hazan buying slaves, no problem in Charleston, not then. Slide. The 1820 census shows David's growing family. David and Sarah with 3 children under 10 and 2 female slaves, presumably domestic servants. Slide. Aged about 45, this is the earliest image of any Nunes Carvalho we have found so far. David was a leading member of the Reformed Society of Israelites, proponents of a more liberal, less orthodox community. As a result, he attracted many enemies. David and Sarah's eldest son, Solomon, worked throughout the Caribbean and in Barbados in the 1830s, working for his mother, Sarah's brother, J. Cohen d'Azevedo, a merchant who had several ships. On returning to America, his vessel was shipwrecked off Delaware. Through swimming ashore, the lives of passengers and crew were saved, but all without money. Solomon's art came in good stead, and by drawing crayon portraits of people in the village, he raised enough money to return home. Slide. In 1838, aged just 23, Solomon was in Charleston as a professional artist. The Beth Elohim synagogue burned down that year, so he painted it from memory, and it now hangs in the synagogue museum. He was also running a dry goods store in Charleston. Despite their obvious creative and intellectual talents, the Carvalhos never shirked hard graft in making their living. Slide. Carvalho and Hirsch. This is an advertisement for a positive sale of clothing and dry goods at the northeast corner of Society in King Street, number 286, in 1841. Slide. In 1840, Solomon painted the Child with Rabbits picture, which was subsequently used on many US and Canadian banknotes. In 1841, the family moved back to Barbados. David as a watchmaker, son Solomon, now 26, painting portraits and miniatures. And on 18th of October 1842, the Mrs. Carvalho, that is Solomon's sisters, recently arrived from Philadelphia, will conduct a mantua making and millinery business at the corner of Victoria Street and Bolton Lane, number 10. Slide. Here it is today. But just 1 month later, tragedy struck. On Sunday morning at the residence of her brother, Mr. Solomon Nunes Carvalho, Miss Sarah Carvalho, aged 19 years and 2 months, daughter of David Nunes Carvalho, Esquire, and Sarah, formerly of Charleston, South Carolina, and recently arrived from America, died of yellow fever after 3 days' illness and was buried yesterday in the synagogue burial ground. Slide. And just 8 weeks later, on the 11th of January 1843, died on Saturday evening of yellow fever at the residence of his father David Carvalho in Bolton Lane, Benjamin Carvalho, aged 15 years 3 months. Solomon's siblings, teenagers Sarah and Benjamin, were buried together in the Jewish cemetery. Slide. We were quite moved by seeing this and realizing they had been members of our own family. Perhaps the double tragedy of the 2 children, Solomon's siblings, was the reason why in 1844, the much reduced Carvalho family left Barbados on d'Azevedo's ship Turk's Island for Philadelphia, David now described as a watchmaker. Slide. In Philadelphia, Solomon, a handsome young man, aged 29, met and fell for the lovely 20-year-old Sarah Miriam Solis. Slide. Sarah's father had died, so Solomon wrote to her brother seeking his approval to the marriage. Here are a few extracts. Dear sir, I take the liberty to address you on a subject of much moment and importance to me. For your esteemed sister Sarah, I have conceived other than mere commonplace feelings. Her amiability, sweetness of temper, congeniality of disposition, and I dare hope a reciprocity of sentiment, have awakened in my bosom feelings of a deep and ardent affection. As her guardian, may I acquaint you with my pretensions and obtain your sanction that I may make her honourable proposals of marriage. My personal character have won me a respectable standing in society. My pecuniary means are sufficiently ample to offer to a wife all the comforts and necessaries of life, if not all its luxuries. Should I be so fortunate to receive your sanction, I would cherish your sister. 3 months later, they were married and went on honeymoon to the West Indies, where they were shipwrecked. They were a good-looking young couple. Just look at this portrait he painted of his lovely young wife, Sarah. Slide. It's now at the Yeshiva University Museum in New York. I could not resist photoing Nancy in front of it. Slide. Yeshiva blogged, here's Nancy from London, England, virtually visiting her great-great-granny Sarah at Yeshiva. Slide. In 1853, Solomon's father, David, aged 68 and now in Philadelphia, purchased for $600 a considerable sum, quote, 3 Negro slaves, to wit, Rose, age 37, Dinah, 35, and Flora, age 70. Flora not warranted sound. An aged mother and 2 daughters. Perhaps David was buying them to look after him and Solomon's young family when Solomon was heading off on his Fremont Expedition. Slide. Solomon had learned the daguerreotype process of photography in early form. His reputation grew so that Colonel John Fremont asked him to be official photographer on his 1853 expedition across the Rockies to map a railroad route to California. The expedition set off from Kansas City on horseback in September 1853. They suffered terribly in the freezing winter, taking 6 months to get to Utah. Solomon was too weak to continue from there and convalesced in Salt Lake City, rescued by the Mormons, who by then had only been in Utah a few years. In 1856, Solomon published Incidents of Travel and Adventure with Colonel Fremont. Slide. It sold for a few cents. The book was a wild success, with Solomon described as artist hero of the Wild West. First editions now cost thousands of dollars, if you can find one. Slide. In 1865, Solomon painted Abraham Lincoln for his second inauguration. His son David always maintained that he went with his father to the White House for the sitting and sat on Lincoln's lap and played with his watch. As David would have been 17 at the time, this seemed somewhat unlikely. In 1872, Solomon sailed to Martinique with his son David. Slide. But the trip caused Solomon eye problems, and in 1873 he underwent surgery for cataracts. Cataract surgery in 1873, imagine. It appears Solomon painted no more portraits after that date, and so he reinvented himself as a professor, though academically quite unqualified. Slides. In 1876, age 61, he patented his steam heating system and was awarded the American Institute's Medal of Excellence. Solomon's grandchildren adored him. Claire Carvalho wrote in her biography, "We all loved to visit him. I remember my darling grandfather wearing a black velvet smoking jacket, greeting us with a hug and a kiss. He entertained us royally. Grandmother, too, always seemed able to change the temper of her grandchildren into a pleasing one, as we all had and still have the hot, impatient tempers which we inherit from our Portuguese and Spanish forebears." Solomon died in 1897, and he and his wife Sarah are buried in the 4th Shireth Cemetery in Queens, New York, as are several other Carvalhos. We have visited all their graves, which are kept immaculate. Solomon had 2 sons, Solomon Solis and David. Slide. Solomon Solis worked for Randolph Hearst as his business manager. Several consider him to be the role model for Bernstein in Orson Welles' Citizen Kane. Slide. David became a handwriting expert. Claire Carvalho's book of her father David, Crime in Ink, related how he had provided evidence for the notorious Dreyfus treason trial in Paris. He had inherited his parents' good looks, a striking young man, described by his future wife Annie when she, playing piano at a ball, first glimpsed him dancing as, quote, an Adonis, so handsome. Within a few weeks, they had married, and 9 months later, Nancy's grandmother-to-be, Adele, arrived. Here is 19-year-old Adele, slide. In 1907, Adele met and fell in love with Captain Ernest French, a doctor with the British Army Medical Corps, up from Jamaica, but according to his baptismal record, illegitimate and coloured. Not quite what widowed David Carvalho had in mind for his beloved daughter Adele. Perhaps because he disapproved of Ernest's humble origins and doubtful pedigree, or because she had married out, David did not attend her wedding and never spoke to his daughter again. A shame, as it appears to have been a successful marriage. Slide. When 12 years ago we commenced this research, the Carvalhos were remote figures from the past, but now we feel we know them personally, especially Solomon. The Carvalhos were quite a family. Nancy and I hope this has given you a brief understanding as to Solomon's humble European family origins, and hope you share our imagination for what he became, a true Jewish American hero. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. That was truly fascinating, truly comprehensive. It's really amazing to see the level of research that you all did and how it took you around the world to discover the roots of this family. And it's a truly incredible story. Thank you for joining us today. Now, to tell us about the time Solomon Carvalho spent living in Charleston, South Carolina, and more specifically about paintings he produced of the city's synagogue, we are joined by Anita Rosenberg. Anita's the historical and preservation volunteer at Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim, one of the oldest synagogues in the United States, located in Charleston. She is past president, synagogue historian, and chair of the Museum, Archives, and Fine Arts Committee. Anita continues to conduct frequent tours for individuals, students, teachers, families, and large groups, focusing on Beth Elohim's historic sanctuary and the Cumming Street and Hugon Avenue cemeteries. Anita, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Now we can look at Solomon's years in Charleston. He was born in Charleston, April 29th, 1815, into this Portuguese Sephardic Jewish family we've learned so much about. Thank you, Keith. Solomon was the eldest child of David Nunez Carvalho, who was a jeweler and a watchmaker, and Sarah Cohen de Zavido, both hailing from important Jewish families. Having been raised as an Orthodox Jew, he disagreed with his father, David Nunez Carvalho, who joined with Isaac Harvey and Abraham Moise, both my great-great-great-grandfathers, in founding the Reformed Society of Israelites in 1824. The Charleston of Solomon's childhood was a city of culture, fine dining, hotels, theater, art, and music for the aristocratic and educated classes. Creativity was honored and encouraged. Having been raised in an environment of creativity, he was encouraged to develop his own artistic skills. He may have wandered the wharves and docks of the shipping trade and our busy city market. As a young boy, it is believed that he attended Harvey's Academy on Trad Street, where Isaac Harvey, my great-grandfather, was the headmaster. There he would have studied literature, Latin, Greek, and according to family tradition, he would also have studied art. Sources cite various prominent artistic influences in his early education. His reputation as a painter of miniatures and full-size portraits grew in Charleston. The Charleston Courier noted that he received a commission to paint South Carolina Senator William Preston and other very prominent citizens. It has been documented that his earliest known portrait is of Dr. David Camden de Leon, another of my ancestors in early Charleston. Let's see the picture of the synagogue interior, please, Derek. There's handsome Solomon. Now we need to see the picture of there we are. In April 1838, fire raged through downtown Charleston, burning more than a quarter of the city, including our 1794 sanctuary of Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim. Our synagogue was within what became known as the Burnt District. Immediately, 23-year-old Solomon, who was living in Baltimore at the time, painted from memory a detailed rendering of the interior of the synagogue. You can see where the men sat on each side on the benches. The women were in balconies above. The bima was in the middle. And this painting was the guideline for the new synagogue that we built in 1840 by David Lopez. So we know what the interior looked like. He brought his painting to the board of trustees and said, pay me whatever you think it's worth. It's yours. They paid him $50. As a synagogue, we are so fortunate that this painting is now ours and hangs in our synagogue museum for visitors to see. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. That was a really wonderful presentation. I hope to have the opportunity to visit someday. I've been to the synagogue in Newport and the one in Savannah as well. And I think if I'm not mistaken, yours plus those two are the three oldest in terms of their
Yes,
history.
indeed. Do come. We do tours every day except Shabbat.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us today. We'll now turn to a different aspect of Carvalho's life, his time out west in California, where Mel resides, and his Jewish connections there. Here with us to tell us about this is Dr. Ava Khan, who holds a PhD in history from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her publications include Jewish Voices of the California Gold Rush, a documentary history, Jewish Life in the American West, Jews of the Pacific Coast, Reinventing Community on America's Edge, and California Jews and Transnational Traditions, New Perspectives on American Jewish History. Dr. Khan taught at UC Davis, Mills College, and SFSU, served as a research associate at the Western Jewish History Center of the Magnus Museum, and as a visiting scholar at the California Studies Center, University of California, Berkeley. She authored the introduction to Incidents of Travel and Adventure in the Far West with Colonel Fremont's Last Expedition by Solomon Carvalho, University of Nebraska Press. Dr. Khan, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone who's spoken before. It's been very educational. And thank you, Mel, for recognizing the California influence that Carvalho had. I appreciate it. I want to start by saying how I first met Solomon Carvalho. I encountered him when I was the research associate at the Western Jewish History Center. And I was looking at the rabbi collection of Rabbi Ekman, who was the first rabbi in San Francisco. And in this collection, I found a letter that Ekman had written to Carvalho. And the letter was written in 1855, shortly after Carvalho returned to the East. And in the letter, Ekman writes, and I should have asked for a slide at the beginning. I'm sorry. And I'm on my second slide at the moment, if those are possible. That's the first slide is the incidents of travel. Yes, this is Rabbi Ekman. Thank you. In this letter, Ekman wrote to Carvalho, I expect, please God, to receive a few lines stating your safe arrival home and the health of yourself and your family. Oh, the next slide, please. That's the letter. This was written after he had spent time with Ekman in San Francisco. Now, Carvalho started his journey home by way of San Francisco while waiting for the ship that would take him home, and he probably spent time with Ekman. However, none of this is recorded in the incidents of travel, or is the fact that they would have been close friends because Ekman was a supporter of traditional Judaism, as was Carvalho. And traditional Judaism was going out of favor in San Francisco at the time. So supporters showing up was very important to Ekman. Carvalho first met Rabbi Ekman, though, when Ekman had served the Charleston community. However, by 1854, he was the rabbi of Emmanuel in San Francisco. Another man from Charleston, Abraham Cohn Labat, was the founding president of Emmanuel. So there's this close contact between Charleston and San Francisco. Abraham Cohn Labat, with Carvalho's father, was one of the 43 men who signed the Constitution of the Reformed Society of Israelites, as already discussed, and Solomon was 10 years old at the time. So also active in the San Francisco community was Abraham Cohn Labat's son, Henry J. Labat, and I think we have a slide of him as well. And he would have been someone who Carvalho spent time with in San Francisco. In Los Angeles, Carvalho lived over the store of the brothers of Henry Labat and Solomon's son. These were Joseph and Samuel Labat, who were also from Charleston. Therefore, it's very excuse me, I'm losing my vocabulary here. It's very puzzling that in the instance of travel, there's absolutely no mention of the connection. It talks about the Labats as strangers. In July of 1854, Carvalho joined the Labat brothers and 28 others to form a society and purchase land for a cemetery. This is the first Jewish organization in Los Angeles. Slide, please. And it was reported in the Occident that this is the meeting in Los Angeles for obtaining a graveyard, and Samuel K. Labat was president. And as you see here, it was resolved unanimously that the thanks of this meeting be tendered to Mr. S.N. Carvalho for his valuable service in organizing the society, and that he be elected an honorary member. And they wanted the proceedings to be published in the Occident. Let's see. While founding the first Jewish organization in the city was a significant development for West Coast Jewry, Carvalho didn't record any observations of this or his involvement. So there, as we all know, in the instance of travel, there's no mention that he was Jewish or had met with other Jews along the way. From my perspective, the things that mystify me most about the book, slide please, is that although he talks about what he wouldn't eat, there's never that he wouldn't eat types of meat that would not be considered kosher, although nothing was slaughtered in a kosher ritual. He never says why. He also calls the Labat family strangers, doesn't mention the LA Jewish community or the San Francisco Jewish community and his longtime friend, Julius Ekman. And one could suppose that this was because what he was writing was something for publication for Fremont. It was hoping to help with Fremont's election. It's very troubling to me in understanding the work that we never see any evidence of his Jewish background, as we're honoring him for all his work and his amazing contributions. But yet, probably because of anti-Semitism and because of it being a political document, hoping that this would get Fremont elected to the presidency, there's no mention of any of his contact with his Jewish friends in the far West. Anyway, I know other people are going to talk about the West, so I think I will leave it at that. But thank you, Mel, so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. And I'm hoping more work will be done to put his Jewish background in context. Thank you so much, and I'll let you move on to the next speaker.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Khan. It's truly fascinating and really putting it all together, how we started this story in the Iberian Peninsula, traveled to the United Kingdom, the Caribbean, the Southeast United States, and now to the West Coast. It's a truly remarkable story of both Solomon Carvalho and his family in general. Continuing with Solomon Carvalho's adventures out west, we turn now to Dr. Michael Hoberman, who will discuss Carvalho's time spent in the newly emerging city of Los Angeles. Dr. Michael Hoberman is a professor of American literature at Fitchburg State University in Massachusetts, and he's a graduate of Reed College and earned his PhD in American Studies from UMass Amherst. Hoberman's books include New Israel, New England, Jews and Puritans in Early America, and 100 Acres of America, the Geography of Jewish American Literary History. He has published articles on Jewish American history in several journals and periodicals, including Tablet Magazine. He lives in Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts. Thank you, Dr. Hoberman, for being with us today.
Thank you so much to all the previous speakers. And thank you, Dr. Khan in particular, because some of the things you've said will give me a springboard to talk, kind of respond to. I liked hearing from Dr. Khan how she first became acquainted with Carvalho, and so I'll follow suit and do the same. As you heard in the bio, a few years ago, I published a book on basically 100 Acres of America, is a book about how Jewish writers through several generations, Jewish writers in America, have written about the American landscape. And I featured Carvalho in the opening chapter of that book as an exemplar of a Jewish writer addressing the frontier experience and the wilderness experience of America. And I too was mystified by the lack of but not surprised, I guess, by the lack of any overt mention of Jewish affiliation on his part. There are a few times in the book where, as Dr. Kahn mentioned, he speaks about things he ate or things he was reluctant to eat. He certainly did violate the rules of kashrut many times, as he confesses, although he doesn't say anything about them being Jewish rules. Just because there was nothing else to eat but unkosher meat in several situations. I found that, and this is really a surmise and kind of a speculation on my part as a literary historian, that what seemed to me, potentially, I guess, I don't want to say characteristically Jewish, but something other than a way in which Carvalho, in his book Incidents, goes against the grain of the tradition of American frontier writers. The tradition of American frontier writers was very often about the conquest of the West, and featured the person traveling, as Carvalho does, for instance, across the Rocky Mountains, as some triumphant hero. And there are many times in Incidents in which Carvalho does basically the opposite, which is to say, he draws attention to how inexperienced he was. He makes fun of himself several times. There's a particular episode where he is invited to be participating in a buffalo hunt on the prairie. This is before they get to the Rockies. And he falls short of everything that a buffalo hunter is supposed to know. He doesn't know anything about it. It's a very interesting and humorous episode. So that's as far as I could get in terms of trying to understand why he omits these sorts of details. But I do agree with what Dr. Kahn suggested, which is that this book, Incidents, first of all, it was written almost in secret, in the sense that Fremont was forbidding any member of that group to publish anything, and Carvalho, or to even keep a journal. And of course, Carvalho was taking pictures, but most of those pictures were destroyed. So the way he was able to put that book together, as historians have explained, is that basically he wrote letters to his wife at home, and then he, upon his return, he took those letters and he strung them together to create a really readable, interesting narrative. So taking that into account, I guess he would have been reluctant to go against any of Fremont's wishes, and he certainly would not have wanted to jeopardize Fremont's chances as a presidential candidate. So it does stand to reason what Dr. Kahn said there. So again, I think I was asked to speak about his time in Los Angeles, and we heard previously about the culminating event for our purposes, which is really helping to establish a Jewish community there. But I'll speak a little bit more anecdotally about basically parts of Incidents in which he does talk about his visit to Los Angeles. They make for some very interesting writing and sort of, travel writing. So after he has his period of convalescence in Utah, unable to complete the journey with Fremont, he does complete the trip to California after a few weeks, and he describes towards the end of Incidents the journey of 850 miles from Utah to Southern California. And it's an interesting story. In many parts of the book, he doesn't hesitate to describe the beauty of the landscape of the Rockies and even the Great Plains. But when he has to cross the Nevada desert, he apparently is not too thrilled. He describes, for instance, coming upon places where there's one place where over a mile of the trail, there were the bodies of 40 dead oxen and cows, deserted wagons, scattered chairs and tables. He described it as a howling and barren wilderness. And at one point he says, I did not observe during the last day's travel a lizard or any kind of sign of animal or insect life. And so there he is in the Great Basin. But then finally on June 8th, 1854, he makes the crossing of Cajon Pass. I hope I pronounced that correctly because I'm not a California person. And upon crossing that pass, he enters what he describes as a fairyland, which is to say he's on his way into California. And he draws many contrasts between what he's been seeing over the previous 800 miles and the beauty of Southern California, grapevines which hang gracefully from the branches of lofty trees. He ends up going to San Bernardino, spent some time there. He describes crossing a field of wild mustard over the 45-mile trip between San Bernardino and Los Angeles. And then finally, I'll get to a slide that I do have here, which is just to give you an image of what Los Angeles looked like at that time. This is, it was nothing like what we picture it as being today. Curiously, I found particularly in the descriptions in incidents of his time in Los Angeles, and then as you pick up the record of his interactions that, for instance, that Dr. Kahn was speaking of, but in his time during Los Angeles, he seems to pick up on two features of that place. One, again, after the privations of the desert, he is taken by the physical beauty and the elegance of certain high society people in California. He says at one point, the California ladies, and in this case, when he speaks of ladies in that context, I think he means of Spanish origin, perhaps of Anglo-American as well. He describes them as generally brunettes. He describes these women that he encounters as wearing 3-foot-long tresses in their hair, and that in the evening, a great deal of care and pains are taken to comb and plait their hair. He describes their clothing, their shawls, their fans, their mantillas, but clearly what he's describing is a very small portion of the population of Los Angeles. He says at one point there are a few American families residing there. Again, I think he means Anglo-American. And he spent a good deal of time among some Spanish-speaking people, which was an interesting moment for him because he refers to speaking Spanish with them, which he knew based on his Sephardic background, and also dancing with some of the beautiful senoritas, as he put it. By the way, when he was in Utah, he danced with 19 of Brigham Young's wives as well. So he was a bit of a ballroom dancer. So that's the elegant side of California, of Southern California, as one element in his story. But then on the facing page, as it were, he talks about the absolute social chaos that he encounters there. Early in the morning, walking the streets of this town that you're looking at here that ends up becoming Los Angeles, he says the talk of the street is, how many murders were committed last night? And then the answer is only 4, 3 Indians and a Mexican. In the same portion of his description there, he speaks of the gambling habit that has taken over. He speaks of it in connection with people in San Francisco as well. But before he gets to San Francisco, he describes a similar gambling habit on the part of Los Angelinos as well. And he speaks of them as being very risky and sort of reckless people, and describes a scene of social chaos that is dominant there. And so when, not in the incidents, but in the other records that Dr. Kahn referred to, when we read about his time spent with, I'll put an image that's not of the Labatt store exactly, but whoops, that's the same one you had before. This is another row of Jewish-owned stores. This is roughly 1870. He spends time, as Dr. Kahn said, with Samuel and Joe Labatt, Joseph Labatt, in their China store. He made some paintings while he was there that he then raffled off for charity. It's there, again, nothing, he says nothing about this in his own writing, but the records, for instance, in the Occident that we heard about, tell us about his interactions here, and in particular, this initiation of the first Hebrew Benevolent Society of California. So, I guess what's interesting to me to wrap things up is some conclusions I would draw about Carvalho in this context. First of all, from my standpoint as a literary scholar, I would just say Carvalho is a very lively writer. He is a lot of fun to read. even when he's describing absolute privation, but especially when he's telling humorous stories about his trip. He is a prescient social observer, as his remarks regarding that social chaos in California suggest. And I think in his acts, particularly the acts that involve the creation of this Hebrew Benevolent Society before he leaves California, I guess it would be July of 1854. In those acts, he demonstrates an instinct that I think I would say inherited from previous generations of his family, an instinct and a drive towards being part of a community and trying to create some kind of social stability within that community. I'll leave it off there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hoberman. That was a really interesting chapter in Carvalho's life, and really enjoyed listening to that history. Thank you for joining us today. Next, I would like to turn towards examining Solomon Carvalho's life as an artist, considering his photography in the greater context of the 19th century. Here to do that for us today is Dr. Micah Christensen. Dr. Christensen earned his doctorate in the history of art from University College London, where he traveled. During that time, he traveled throughout Spain, Italy, France, and the United Kingdom to study how artists were trained in the 18th and 19th centuries. He received his master's in fine art from Sotheby's Institute in London, and there he worked with the founder of the Antique Home Roadshow and other experts in the London auction world. Dr. Christensen has lectured extensively, including at the British Library. He's currently a partner at Anthony's Fine Art and Antiques, Salt Lake City, and a board member of the Springville Museum of Art and Plein Air magazine. He continues to lecture, write, and consult with public institutions and private collectors around the world. He is co-author of the Dictionary of Utah Fine Artists and the forthcoming Educating Joaquin Sorolla y Bastida. I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. Dr. Christensen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's an honor, and I'm very humbled to be here. I have to say, Dr. Hoberman, is somebody who's made that trip many times from Utah to California, that not much has changed from Carvalho's description in the past 170 years. It's pretty desolate through most of that region. And I also have found him to be a very convincing and candid writer. As I was preparing this presentation, I have to apologize in advance. I thought that I was mostly speaking about his painting and not his photography, but I will also talk about his photography, even though my slides are generally focused on his paintings.
Dr. Christensen, that's my mistake. If I wrote that in wrong, you can focus your presentation.
Oh boy, the pressure's off then. Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Go ahead.
But I will talk about it because it's intrinsic to who he was as a multifaceted visual artist. Before I get started and talk about his work in particular, I'd just like to say something general about being an artist in the 19th century, especially in America. Today, we think of art in very general terms. Almost anything passes as being art. But in the time that Carvalho was a artist, art was a fairly regimented and hierarchical system. And the artists who are considered of the most worth and the most skilled were figurative artists. And at the lower level of those rungs were artists who did still life or landscape. So for Carvalho to be painting portraits put him immediately in the higher ranks of someone who was educated, someone who was working at a skill level that was higher than most, and especially in the United States, where there were very few centers to be trained as an artist during the first half of the 19th century. Most artists were self-taught, and those who were self-taught only aspired to do basic drawings, basic watercolors, and probably 95 to 99% of all portraits that were done in the United States in the first half of the 19th century were silhouettes, cutouts that were done by individuals who would shine a bright light on an individual and cut a paper silhouette, which some of you may have seen. Carvalho as we can see here at, in his 20s, had already mastered a very high level of artistic skill. He wasn't always consistent in his work. For those of us who have seen many of his portraits, his work could sometimes be wooden by today's standards, but we need to judge him by the highest level of his skill, I believe. And this is certainly in those higher ranks. There's a family tradition in the Carvalho family that he was trained by Thomas Sully, who was an American that had trained in England. Now, there's not a great deal of evidence for whether or not that actually happened, but it's also not very likely that Carvalho had acquired these skills on his own. It's likely that he trained or apprenticed with an artist who had serious skills. I'd like to take this moment to just say something in general. There's about figurative art in Judaism. There is a lot of misconceptions about whether or not Jewish artists were allowed to paint. And there's a long tradition of Jewish artists doing visual art going back to ancient times. It's probably more likely in the history of Western art in particular, not that Jews were not allowed to paint within the confines of their own religion and tradition, but that Jews were not allowed into academies that were run by non-Jews. And as a result, there isn't a large visual record of Jews because there weren't many who could paint in oil and do traditional portraits. And in this way, being in the United States was an advantage for Carvalho. By living in the United States and being self-taught, where there were almost no academies and no rules on who could or could not paint, Carvalho was able to do something that Jewish artists in Europe were very rarely able to do, which was to set up shop as a professional artist and to do dozens, if not hundreds, of portraits. Now, I say if not hundreds because there's still a lot of work to do to identify the work that Carvalho's done. It's estimated that as much as 70% of his works are still unidentified or unknown. We've already heard about this painting. I would just like to briefly say about this interior work that as an artist and discussing in particular his legacy, it's important to know that he saw his work and his skill set as an effort to preserve. It was said earlier that in 1838, the Great Fire of Charleston destroyed this building. And for Carvalho to be in Baltimore and to make this work was a remarkable testament to his dedication to the community, to historical preservation of memory, and also shows great skill. This is not an amateur work. The ability to manage the perspective, the light, and to do all that he did convincingly showed how he had achieved a level of skill that most American artists, especially those who had not traveled to Europe and trained in European academies, that he had truly mastered a remarkable set of skills. This portrait of John C. Fremont is how I became acquainted at first with Carvalho. I have a gallery in Salt Lake City, Utah, and after returning from London, where I did my master's and PhD, this painting was brought through my doors by a local collector. It was signed Carvalho, as you can see in the bottom left-hand side, and it was apparently painted while he was here in Utah and passed down through the family. The tradition is, and it's discussed a little bit in Carvalho's own published journals of being in Utah, that the ragged clothes he had worn while traveling west with Fremont were not acceptable for the kinds of balls he was invited to dance in with the governor and other members of the local community here, and that he was given a jacket to wear. Now, what's not said in his journals is that he exchanged this painting for the jacket. This is now in a local collection, a private collection, and I have been told that it's destined to come to be donated to a museum of the history of Utah that's being built right now. It's one of 3 known portraits that Carvalho did of Fremont during their time. Something that hasn't been mentioned, I don't believe, but is generally well known, is that both Fremont and Carvalho were from the Carolinas, and they knew each other when they were both younger. But Fremont required Carvalho to compete with another photographer at the time who had a very different process for photographing. So it was only after Carvalho had arrived in Kansas City when he was asked to compete. From what I understand, it was a surprise. He thought that he was supposed to be on the journey, and the contract had been signed and everything was sure. But when he arrived in Kansas City, he was told that the future of his position on this expedition was to be determined by his success in making photographs that were quick and that were stable. And he won that competition. As we've heard already, the great tragedy of this trip is that almost all of his photographs were destroyed, but the paintings remain. And this here is a painting that is not widely known to be by Carvalho. In fact, it was until only a year ago, it was attributed to another artist who was a local Latter-day Saint or Mormon painter of Brigham Young. But now it is believed very strongly by scholars that this is actually by Carvalho. When he arrived in Utah, Carvalho was ill. He had scurvy and was near death. He was nursed back to health by Mormon, or as they prefer to be called now, Latter-day Saint pioneers, who had only been in the state for 7 years, in the territory then for 7 years. And when Brigham Young heard that there was a photographer slash artist slash explorer, and surprisingly for Brigham Young, he was most interested in the Jewishness of Carvalho when he arrived. He sent a carriage to pick up Carvalho. He was taken to Salt Lake, which was then the seat of government for the territory, which spanned from Canada, Idaho, parts of Montana, Utah, Arizona, and large parts of Nevada at the time. They were all under the control of Brigham Young, who was called the territorial governor. And there was no attempt by Brigham Young to convert Carvalho, as he did with almost everyone else. And as someone I myself am of Jewish descent and am also was raised as a Latter-day Saint, I'd like to unpackage something here that I think has not been said very much by people who've written about this time with Carvalho and Brigham Young. And that's that the Latter-day Saints have a very peculiar self-image. They believe that they are adopted into the tribe of Israel. And at the time of Carvalho's visit, Latter-day Saints or the Mormons, they referred to everyone who is not a Mormon as a Gentile. The Latter-day Saints did not consider themselves Gentiles. And when Carvalho arrived, Brigham Young considered himself a member of the tribe and considered himself in many ways to be a relative of Carvalho, and spoke to him in that way, which is a very peculiar thing to us nowadays, but that's how he saw it. And he took Carvalho with him to dinners, to parties, and to go see Chief Wacara. But before I say this about something about Chief Wacara and their visit, I'd just like to say that that Carvalho's artistic work as a portraitist gave him entree into these powerful people and these somewhat these people who wanted to project themselves in a particular way. And it's fascinating to see in this portrait Brigham Young in the most sophisticated light, even though he's in the wilderness largely, seen by other Americans that way, very much so. But seen, you can see a column in the background as if he's in a civilized region. He also has the mountains in the background. He has a cane. He's dressed well. He's wearing the fashion of the time, his signet ring and his cane. Carvalho was the first person to who was not a member of the church and who had visited Utah to paint Brigham Young. And it was important to Brigham Young to be seen in a particular way. And Carvalho, in his journals and in his art, is very respectful, which is something we see in this portrait of Chief Wacara. Now, I'm not an expert on early writers of the West, but I am familiar as someone who's grown up here and who's read a lot of literature of the time, that and also who has read the journals of many people traveling in the West and artists. There was a great deal of sensationalizing of the Native Americans, and a desire on the part of Americans and other Westerners to see the West as wild and to make it a place that that was almost fictionalized and adventurous. And Carvalho, in his portrait and also in his writings, is very respectful of Chief Wacara, who was essentially the governor of the Native Americans at a time when they were at war with both the American government and with the Mormons. And to be a firsthand witness and one of the few firsthand witnesses to the negotiation between the Latter-day Saints and between the Native Americans, Carvalho was exceptionally respectful. This painting is now in the Gilcrease Museum, and I believe it is the only known portrait that we have of Chief Wacara. The West, as it was painted by Carvalho, is fascinating to me. I have been written many times on the works of Albert Bierstadt, on Thomas Cole, on other pioneering Western artists. And for those who painted the Red Rock portion of the United States, something that still has not been written about, that I believe that perhaps we're in the beginning of a conversation because of this Hall of Fame discussion we're having, is Carvalho as one of the earliest, maybe the earliest painter of portions of the Western United States. And his words have always carried weight, but I believe there's still more work to do to put him in the same territory of those like Bierstadt and Cole who painted the West. I'll finish by talking just briefly about this painting of Abraham Lincoln. When we're talking about the legacy of an artist like Carvalho, that legacy has something to do not only with how he saw the world and influenced us living today, but also how he influenced his contemporaries. And this was one of the most widely reproduced images in the United States of Abraham Lincoln following his death. And why it was so widely distributed is because of the interpretation of Abraham Lincoln. By this time and by his death, Abraham Lincoln's image was very, very well known. But it's the inclusion of Diogenes, the ancient philosopher who famously carried a lamp wherever he went in search of a man who was honest. And everyone would have known the anecdote in the 19th century, every educated American would have known that the story of Alexander the Great visiting Diogenes and finding him sitting in a barrel with his famous lamp, and asking the great philosopher what he, Alexander the Great, could do for Diogenes the philosopher. And Diogenes responded, "You can get out of my light." Now, to depict Abraham Lincoln as the person that Diogenes was looking for, the Diogenes was so shocked by seeing Abraham Lincoln and the honest man that he dropped his lamp, was seen as a brilliant dedication by contemporary Americans of who Abraham Lincoln was. And to have it be done by someone who was not only an American, but who was Southern and who is Jewish, I think says a great deal about all of the places that Carvalho fit. All of this Venn diagram of Carvalho as someone who inhabited many roles as a explorer, as a man of letters, as an American, as someone who was Southern, but who was also an American at a time of great division. He truly spanned, and I think we're only beginning to understand now with discussions like this, just how unique and powerful of a force he was and the legacy that he's given us. Thank you for inviting me, and it's been a great pleasure to learn more about him through you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christensen, for your expertise on this subject. It's really fascinating. It's really interesting, and I was not aware of this. And having spent some time in Utah myself, I always found it interesting, some of the parallels between Utah as the promised land in the Latter-day Saints tradition and the land of Israel, and some other historical connections between the Jewish people and the Mormon people as well. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
We'll now hear from someone who has previously produced a documentary about Solomon Carvalho, seeking to share his story with the wider world, Steve Rivo. Steve produced the documentary Carvalho's Journey, as well as the TV series Death Row Stories, The Hunt with John Walsh, Disappeared, Anthony Bourdain Parts Unknown, Broadway musicals, A Jewish Legacy, and many more. Thank you, Steve, for joining us today.
Thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here and to see some of you again who I haven't seen in years, and to hear all this incredible work that's been done on Carvalho. It's really an extraordinary thing that we're doing today, so I really appreciate being included. My name is Steve Rivo, and in 2015, I released a documentary film that I wrote and directed called Carvalho's Journey. The film was a multi-year labor of love. The project began when I received a copy of a book by Arlene Hirschfelder, who called Photo Odyssey, Solomon Carvalho's Remarkable Western Adventure. Someone sent it to me in the mail. I wasn't quite sure who or why, but prior to receiving the book, I'd never heard of Carvalho, like so many people. But I'd worked on a number of documentary films for public television about American history and culture and art, including on artists, including Ansel Adams and Eugene O'Neill. And I was very interested in American Jewish history, so I was intrigued immediately. Arlene's husband, Dennis Hirschfelder, was the one who had sent me the book, and he had decided that this was a story that would make a great documentary. So he sent me the book, and he called me. We talked. I was very intrigued. Again, I hadn't heard of the story, so the idea of an observant Jew who was the first photographer to travel to the West at the very dawn of photography during the opening of the West sounded incredibly exciting. It was character-driven, a Western adventure story, great topics, themes, American history, Jewish history, Sephardic history, Jews of the South, Manifest Destiny, history of photography, technology, religious, cultural identity. It seemed like it had everything. So I said, great, where are the photos? And Dennis laughed and he said, well, that's a great question. We don't know. There's only one. And so my response to that immediately was to be very disappointed. And I said, well, as a filmmaker, that's like a challenge that I'm not sure that, is surmountable. Film is visual, we need images. It might be a great story, but, we're going to have to show people something. We're going to have to demonstrate visually how this story unfolds. So I started avoiding Dennis's calls, and I sort of moved on to other projects. But a few months later, I got a hold of a copy of a book by Robert Schlaer, who's an artist and daguerreotypist who lives still in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And Robert's book is called Sights Once Seen, Daguerreotyping Fremont's Last Expedition Through the Rockies. And that book, some of you may have seen, Schlaer painstakingly had recreated the path of Fremont's fifth expedition by traveling to all the places where the expedition had gone, and he recreated Carvalho's daguerreotypes in all those different locations as best he could, using all the data and information that he could gather about where the images were made and where the expedition traveled. As soon as I held the book and I looked at the images that Schlaer had created, I realized how we could make this film. So I'm going to show a piece of the film and just talk for a second afterwards. But let me see if I can share my screen, if that works. It's about 9.5 minutes of film. Here we go. And let me know if you cannot hear it as I share.
Some years ago, I came across the story of the daguerreotypist Solomon Carvalho and his trip across the West as the official photographer of an exploring expedition in 1853. When I realized that all of his daguerreotypes seemed to be lost, I decided it would be a perfect project for me to try to find all of the places where Carvalho traveled, and then to go and literally recreate his images using the same process that he used. Yeah, I think Don's right. Carvalho made a daguerreotype of this, and the engraving is very high quality. So we can locate it within maybe 10 feet. Yeah. I think right here is a pretty good choice. All right, here we go. We take it back and develop it. This reconstruction is, of course, partly history, but the most interesting thing about it is finding where my predecessor was and trying to recreate some beautiful object he made. And when I can do that, there's an extraordinary spiritual connection.
The man who took this groundbreaking trip across the West was Solomon Carvalho, a 38-year-old Sephardic Jew born in Charleston, South Carolina.
Carvalho started out as a portrait painter and became a daguerreotypist. Daguerreotyping was a new art, and by all accounts, he was something of an innovator.
Daguerreotype was the first practical form of photography. It was introduced to the public in 1839. For 20 years, it was the principal form of photography, especially in the United States.
The daguerreotype is a process invented in Paris by the Frenchman Louis-Jacques Mandé Daguerre, and it's a process by which nature herself seemed to inscribe her own image on a small silver-plated piece of copper. Americans quickly began to call the daguerreotype a mirror with a memory because the surface of a daguerreotype plate is very reflective. It's as if you looked into a mirror walked away, and the mirror remembered what you looked like. There was simply no language for describing what this marvelous thing really was.
In the late 1840s, Solomon Carvalho had opened his portrait studio in Baltimore, where it was one of only 3 in town. In newspaper advertisements, he claimed that he specialized in correct likenesses of children in 2 seconds of time. He offered a piano for his customers to play and provided a lady in attendance for the comfort of lady visitors. Carvalho's studio was different than any other in the United States. The photographer was an observant Jew.
We don't imagine that Jews are involved in art and photography before the Civil War. Many American Jews still imagine that that's a 20th century story. But here's this guy who may well be the first professional Jewish photographer in all of Jewish history.
Before he discovered daguerreotypes, Carvalho studied as a painter, learning his craft from a number of teachers, including the great American artist Thomas Sully.
He had a really unusual success in his mid-20s. He'd made a painting of a little boy with a rabbit. Somebody must have seen this painting, liked it, and had it printed on paper money. Millions of people were seeing a painting by Carvalho without even knowing it.
Despite his early renown, by 1853, Carvalho was struggling to support his family. He had married Sarah Solis from a prominent Philadelphia Sephardic family, and the couple had young children.
He was a smart fellow. He knew he needed to continue making money. And even before he had children, he knew a lifestyle. So he wanted to keep his lifestyle up.
In the late summer of 1853, Carvalho traveled to New York, hoping to peddle a new invention.
He had invented a process for preserving daguerreotypes by lacquering them, which he was trying to sell in New York.
At the very same time, the great American explorer John C. Fremont was also in New York, searching for a professional daguerreotypist to document his next expedition across the continent. On an earlier mission, Fremont had tried to make daguerreotypes himself, but had failed completely. A recommendation from the photographer Matthew Brady led Fremont to Carvalho. Apparently, the 2 men hit it off, and Fremont made Carvalho an offer that would change his life forever.
On the 22nd of August, 1853, after a short interview with Colonel J.C. Fremont, I accepted his invitation to accompany him as artist of an exploring expedition across the Rocky Mountains. A half hour previously, if anybody had suggested to me the probability of my undertaking an overland journey to California, I should have replied there were no inducements sufficiently powerful to have tempted me. Solomon Carvalho.
In half an hour, he had agreed to go across the continent in the middle of winter without ever asking his wife or telling anyone else. It must have been quite an interesting scene at home when I came to this.
She was a remarkable woman, Sarah. She knew him as an adventurer. He wanted to go beyond what he was accustomed to being in, and she knew that. This was an opportunity that might never come again.
Carvalho tells us that he met Fremont and he felt instantly safe with this man. And it was a very, very bold thing to do. But I do believe that he spotted a chance to help make American history.
This next clip is about 40 minutes into the film.
In late November, while traveling west along the Santa Fe Trail, the expedition stopped to resupply along the Arkansas River. Fremont wrote to his wife about the increasing success of Carvalho's daguerreotypes.
We are producing a line of pictures of exquisite beauty, which will admirably illustrate the country. Every successive picture improves upon its predecessor, and those of yesterday were jewels. They were of a Cheyenne village among the timber. Colonel John C. Fremont.
In a place called Big Timbers. They visited with Cheyenne Indians who were wintering there, right along the river. And Carvalho made portraits of the Indians and pictures of their village.
The Cheyenne village on Big Timber consists of about 250 lodges containing probably 1,000 persons, including men, women, and children. I had great difficulty in getting them to sit still or even submit to having themselves daguerreotyped. I made a picture first of their lodges, which I showed them.
This is the only known surviving daguerreotype that we can clearly attribute to Carvalho and the expedition. The subject is teepee village, several standing men, and the Big Timber.
Was probably damaged over the years, but what we can make out are people doing their daily tasks. We can see Cheyenne lodges, skins that are hanging perhaps to dry after a hunt. It looks like there may be people carrying firewood. It's an average, ordinary scene of everyday life as it would have been to the Cheyennes in the 1850s. He's careful to tell us something of their customs, something of their beliefs, and he does it with a great deal of humanity.
I think the daguerreotype suggests something about how Carvalho sensed he needed to preserve a certain amount of information. He stepped back from the scene and he's carefully framed the image. He's not doing a close-up, at least in this picture, of the two people or of the teepee or of a piece of meat on the ground. He's trying to show us something about native life. I think that one image tells us so much about the connection between these people and Carvalho. I think what we see in this picture is evidence of a collaboration. These Indian subjects knew they were being photographed, and they are looking Carvalho in the eye. This day, these Indians looked at this photographer, and their glance at him is as close as we can come to seeing him ourselves.
Everybody heard that? Was it visible? The film took a number of years to make, involved the collaboration of many, many people, many of whom are probably watching, some of whom presented on this call today. So I'm very grateful. Making documentaries is extremely difficult under any circumstances, particularly historical documentaries, and particularly historical documentaries about little known or unknown characters in history. I was interested in the story particularly because of the fact that he was unknown, not a sort of great man look. Oh, let's do a film about Fremont. Let's do a film about Ulysses S. Grant. Let's do another film about Abraham Lincoln. But the purpose, I think, that we're all here today is to celebrate an individual who, up until recently, whose contributions may have been completely forgotten and may have been lost. So it was an extremely life-altering experience for me to be able to tell the story with the help of so many people. So I'm grateful to be able to participate today. And I'd love, if any of you haven't seen the film, if you are interested in the clip that we showed, it was hard for me to choose just a few minutes to show, but I felt that talking about the daguerreotype itself, showing that piece and the piece of how we set up the film and how we were able to do it, given the fact that there was so little visual material, would sort of whet the appetite and be something that was a little different from what some of the other people have talked about here today. The other thing that I just wanted to note before finishing is that what was as gratifying as showing the film in festivals and on PBS was who came to see it. Keith Atkinson, who's here, and Nancy came to see the film, and we got to meet in person after having communicated, trading research back and forth. People stood up at screenings in cities that I can't even remember, who said that they were distant relatives, or that they had heard about him from some other relative. Somebody approached us who had a musket, a gun that she believed might have been, and hit the one that he took on the expedition, but wasn't sure. And was there a way that we could figure out how to authenticate it? Stuff like that. It was just extraordinary. And when you work on these kinds of films that are trying to bring history alive, to then be in rooms with people who actually are descendants, or like all of you who are so interested and care so deeply about the themes and the topics that we were able to touch with this story, was just extraordinary. So again, I'm just very grateful that we were able to do it. I'm going to put into the chat just how you can see the film today. There's two ways, either by purchasing DVD. We still sell DVDs and Blu-rays. Sorry, let me just get to the chat. Through my distributor, the National Center for Jewish Film at Brandeis University. And then we also have a streamable link that you can rent on Vimeo. Obviously, I prefer that you watch it on as big a screen as possible. And if you're able to watch it on a TV, DVD is usually the best. But you could also get the stream and watch it on your computer. And again, thank you so much for including me in this. And we're all just thrilled that he's being inducted into the Jewish American Hall of Fame. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was really wonderful. It's so important to document this history, and I'm really happy to learn that this is here for posterity, and that it's shareable, and that others can learn from this film. So thank you so much for joining us today. And when Derek follows up with everyone with the recording of the webinar, you can share those links that you just provided as well. Great. Thank you, Steve. In addition to documenting Carvalho's life and examining his art, it's important that visitors to the sites he explored with John Fremont understand the role that Carvalho played in recording these journeys. We'll now hear from someone who has fought for this, Jerry Klinger. Jerry is the son of survivors of Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen, a former yeshiva student, and served with the IDF in the Sinai Peninsula. He's the author of over 100 articles and publications ranging from the Jerusalem Post to the Prairie Connection to the San Diego Jewish World. He's also frequently interviewed on TV and radio about the American Jewish experience. Jerry is the president and founder of the Jewish American Society for Historic Preservation, which has completed projects in 40 US states and in 7 countries, including in Israel, where 25 projects have been completed reflecting the millennia of Jewish experience and history. Over 7 million people annually benefit from these efforts. Jerry, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for letting me be part of this presentation today. I should preface something for you. The projects that we do have one fundamental purpose, and that is to fight anti-Semitism. What I came to learn is that, and I've had it said to my face, maybe it's because my name doesn't sound particularly Jewish to people, and I've had them say to me, those Jews, they have no right to say that, claim anything. They came here after we Christians cleared the frontier, and then they stole it for themselves. Well, obviously that was blatant anti-Semitism. But then I asked a different question. Are they wrong, or they just don't know? Now, everything that we do, whether it's in books, whether it's going to be in movies, documentaries, and Steve, I have to say thank you in particular for something. But what do we do? I'd like to instead do something different. We create permanent physical objects, historic markers, memorials, whatever it is, so that people can walk by and look at it and saying, gee, I didn't know that. And that actually happened to me. We put up a marker in Keokuk, Iowa. That was the site of the first permanent Jewish house of worship in the state of Iowa. So sometimes I'll, go outside and I'll hang around the marker the next day, just curious to see what'll happen. Well, this girl shows up. I guess she was about 23, 25, whatever. She had a baby parked on her hips. And I'm standing there minding my own business. And she said to me, after reading the marker, "I didn't know there were Jews here." Yes, there were. And they were central to the story of Iowa. Now, what took me to the story of Carvalho, and Steve, thank you also to you, because it's a journey. It was a journey I went through. And I didn't begin with Carvalho. Actually, I began with something else. I was looking to place a marker at the first permanent Jewish house of worship in Utah, which is in Salt Lake City. It was called B'nai Israel at the time. And the historic marker is up on I think it's the Peaks Hotel, I can't get the name correctly over here. It's right on their hotel. And the Mormon community was thrilled to be participant in it and support of everything we did. From there, I was referred down to another project that was being sponsored through the Mormon community that was going to be a little bit further south, about the first pioneer Jewish agricultural settlement. And let me see if I have the name. Yep, in Clarion, Utah, southern Utah. And I was dealing with a man by the name of Montbona. He is the person who runs the Mormon Pioneer National Heritage Area. We ended up putting up a series of kiosks, and I worked with Bob Goldberg of the University of Utah, and we had quite a successful program. Wade Allison heard about me, and he is from the Emory County Historical Society. We provide funding for doing these historical markers and programs. And he contacted me. He said he would like to do something at Wild Horse Butte, talking about John C. Fremont. And he mentioned, of course, Carvalho being there. And I said to him, be happy to fund it, be happy to support you. 2 conditions. 1, that Carvalho's Jewish identity be acknowledged. And 2, on the credit line, that the Jewish American Society be recognized. Why I wanted the word Jew to be on there a couple of times. Wasn't any argument, no question asked whatsoever. He said, absolutely. Well, we did the marker. It's actually almost like a mini kiosk right outside Wild Horse Butte, probably very near to where Carvalho actually took the picture that was converted into a pen and ink because the original daguerreotype is lost. And we had a whole program. Did it in April of, I think it was 2014. And here I'm thinking, April, no problem. I'll fly into Salt Lake City. And as I was going over the Wasatch Mountains after I came out of Salt Lake, where it was bright and wonderful, I got caught in a snowstorm. Then I got down into the Green River Valley area, and it was beautiful, barren, desolate almost. And then we got over to where we were doing the dedication. And I got caught there in a hailstorm with everybody. So it sort of felt like a little bit of what he might have been going through. Here it looked beautiful, and then all of a sudden, this was tough. This was a frontier pioneer experience that I was a little bit sharing with the Carvalho story. But then the question always came up, what more could be said? And then I learned about more and more about Carvalho. And Steve, because of you, I saw your film, and you were talking with Bob Schleyer. And I asked you, can you put me in contact with him? Which you kindly did. Because in the film, Schleyer was talking about after he was outside of the obelisk in the Cathedral Valley area. And those obelisks were very important because we have a pen and ink drawing from the original daguerreotype, which is, of course, lost. And that daguerreotype, because of Schleyer and because of a local individual, Kent Jackson, they were able to determine the actual where Fremont went. For decades, they had the wrong area. They said Fremont went about 150, 200 miles north. But when Schleyer went there with Jackson, they realized, and certainly Schleyer did, because when you take a daguerreotype, everything is reversed. And so people couldn't figure out what it was. But Jackson recognized the obelisks. And his family had named them Mom, Pop, and Henry. You know, good name for that. And he was a tour guide, went around for it. And Schleyer said, it would be special if we could just get this area named for Carvalho. I undertook to try and do that. And I inquired with the U.S. Geological Survey, has there been anything anywhere named after a Jew? And the answer was no, nothing. The Geological Survey was very amenable to the idea of naming the obelisks for them, for Carvalho. The Park Service really didn't have much of a say in the matter because they had to be politically neutral. I'll explain a little bit why. But then we also had to get the approval of the local Wayne County commissioners. And when we went to the Wayne County commissioners, instead of reading you their whole response, which is, shall we say, difficult as to what they felt, I'll just read one line because I asked them about would they support the effort of naming the obelisk in honor of Carvalho. And they said to override the local history and name the pillars after someone who has passed by once many years ago would be a disgrace. We thank you for giving us the opportunity to provide our recommendations concerning this name request. We strongly oppose and the proposed name and recommend that it be rejected, flatlined. It's not the first time encountered problems. We can try and get around it. I even offered to try and help them with some historical projects that they have in Fremont. Without the support of the Wayne County commissioners, the National Park Service would not proceed. And they couldn't proceed for a simple reason. The Park Service doesn't have a lot of money. They depend on the good support of the county commissioners to maintain the roads, especially in the winter. And if they had started bucking and causing problems over Carvalho, they in turn, the road system within Capitol Reef would be difficult to maintain. It was easier just to back away. So for a long time, I just said, fine, let it go, moved on. I've done many other projects, scores of projects in the United States and of course around the world. But it's always been in the back of my mind. I contacted Mont Bono not too long ago. And I said, you know, is there something that we can do to talk about the 1853-1854 Fremont Expedition? I'd be willing to fund a series of historic markers in Utah at the sites of where Carvalho is mentioned. And we would put up these things. And as long as you had, again, two conditions, you mentioned Carvalho and identify him as being Jewish, and you put the Jewish American Society on the credit line. Sometimes people will let me even put our logo, which includes a flag of Israel. Not so sure some today will get a little bit of pushback. We are getting pushback, as a matter of fact. And so Mont is looking into it right now. But we're talking about doing a system now of markers across Utah. That one would take place, first of all, at Dewey's Crossing. That's up there with the Green River area. Then we would take it over and follow along the path, probably near Arches, the north end of the national park, Cathedral, into the Cathedral Valley, Capitol Reef, maybe do two. And that was, by the way, that was another thing we had to verify, because you can't just put up a National Park Service lay-by or just because you want to. It has to be area that is not designated as wilderness. So we had a survey run. The obelisks are not within a wilderness area. It is possible to be able to do this if we can get the support together. Then the next part was, where else can we tell the story of Carvalho? Because from there, after they had left the Cathedral Valley area, things really got tough, really tough. The next area that we would mark is in Fremont, Utah. That's also where the Wayne County commissioners are. We put up a marker there. And then across over into Parowan. Parowan is where the ragged band managed to limp in, more dead than alive. And there's a house there, a family called the Heath family, that took Carvalho in, took care of him, nursed him back to health. He was probably 2 inches short of death. And they helped him get better. And then I suggested also to maybe we can also take another marker and take it up back into Salt Lake and tell the story. We're investigating that right now. And why? To prove and to affirm Jewish American historical presence, legitimacy, and the commonality of our experience as American Jews with the story of America itself. So Carvalho was a very special type of story. I'd still like to be able to do it. I can't say we're going to be successful at it. There are people that have their different points of view. As it was explained to me that the people in the Wayne County Commission, you can't really say anti-Semitism. That's really not a fair thing to say. They are very local, very parochial. All politics is local, and they certainly do not like outsiders coming in and telling them what to do. Though I have to admit, I found their excuse in their written email to me as to why they're rejecting it a little bit on the ridiculous side, but have to deal with that, and we have to work with it. So everything that we're talking about, the Carvalho story, when you talk about him, you have to remember when people say there were Jewish pioneers, Jewish frontiersmen, Jewish explorers, and the answer was yes. Carvalho was one of them. There were others before him. We don't really know. We don't think of them too much. Of course, you have the Gomez house up in New York. You have the Simon story on the frontier of Western Pennsylvania. By the way, Joseph Simon wasn't just over there. He even had a synagogue brought into his little place. And whenever there had to be a minyan, Jews seemed to come out of the woodwork out in the wilds of Western Pennsylvania. Simon had another, if you will, a little bit of thing of fame. When the American Revolution took place, he was the one making the guns that were then being delivered to the Americans for creating this great country that we all live in. So the purpose of what I do is an adjunct to everything everybody else is doing. And we always are looking for opportunities, which we'll definitely consider funding if anybody wants to reach out to us, of how we can tell the story of American commonality and fight the scourge of anti-Semitism in the process. So, Steve, I thank you. I don't know, Bob, if you're on, everybody, I thank you for that opportunity, and together we'll work to make a difference. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Before I continue, I just want to mention that if you have a question, the chat had been disabled. I apologize about that. You could put a question in the chat now. But that was really super interesting and very important, Jerry. My own first ancestor in this country, my great-great-grandfather, Benny Gersh, was a frontiersman who homesteaded 200 acres on the North-South Dakota border at the turn of the century. So it's really interesting to hear your perspective on that history. And it got me thinking, one thing I wanted to mention, I had mentioned earlier, our mayor summit against anti-Semitism that we hosted with the mayor of Fort Lauderdale this past week in Florida, which had more than 50 municipalities and mayors represented, from Richmond to Cleveland to New York City, Dallas, Las Vegas, and Providence and others. And one of the things that took place is that mayors pledged themselves to a 10-point action plan for combating anti-Semitism. And one of those points was to proclaim and celebrate Jewish American Heritage Month in May next year. And we actually have a template resolution or proclamation that mayors can use for their communities, which includes language to insert local history here. So if anyone wants to collaborate with us on that effort in the new year, to work with your local communities, your local mayors to help do the work that Jerry's been describing, I think it's a really great opportunity as we're seeing this unprecedented rise in anti-Semitism, that I think we haven't really experienced in any of our lifetime in this country. So thank you, Jerry.
Can I just add two things that I forgot to mention? We can all differences, and you can do it in ways you didn't think. When I had the difficulty, let's say, with Wayne County, I went back to the Capitol Reef Park and I looked at their website, and I dealt with this, the supervisor of the park there. When they talk about, they mention Carvalho, they mention him in their history of the park. They left out one word, Jew. It wasn't included. So with a little bit of encouragement, if you take a look at their website now, you'll find that Carvalho is now identified as an American Jew. At the same time, I also learned that National Geographic was doing a reissue of their survey. It's a big, thick, coffee table book with pictures of all the national parks. They were doing one, they were going to redo it again. And then I learned that the same thing, they talked about Capitol Reef, they talked about Carvalho, and they left out one word, Jew. So if you go back and you take a look at the new publication, you'll find they've added the word in. So Carvalho has been recognized, or his Jewish identity has been recognized at least a little bit in that way. So whatever we can all do, whether it seems big or small, we can make a difference. And I hope everybody will join and we'll do it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jerry. So before we conclude, a few questions have come in. One is there any connection between Carvalho and the first Jewish cemetery built in Los Angeles that is on the ground that is now Chavez Ravine and Dodger Stadium? Does anyone have the answer to that question or would like to chime in? If so, feel free to unmute yourself. If not, we can investigate further and get back to you. Another question is, will the slides be available, and how do I get a copy of Steve's documentary? So Derek, and if all the panelists don't mind, Derek has all the slides, so you can reach out to Derek and he can email the files to you directly. It's Derek at combatantisemitism.org, and he can send that information over to you. Someone's asking what happened to the lost daguerreotypes that were mentioned earlier.
I'm happy to take that if
yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve.
Well, we tell the story in the film, so if anybody wants to hear it it's more artfully told than I can do right now. Evidence, I mean, nothing is conclusive, obviously, and historians on this call, you can hop in if you think this is off base, but based on our research, which was extensive and up to date at the time of the film's release, 2015, all evidence pointed to the fact that after the expedition, the 300 or so completed daguerreotypes that Carvalho produced were owned entirely by Fremont. Their agreement was essentially the same way that if you hire a photographer to photograph for an event, they own the images. Although he probably owned copyright to them, but Fremont owned the actual daguerreotype plates himself. He took the images because at the time there was no process that would allow publishing a photograph that hadn't been invented yet. You couldn't reproduce a photograph in a newspaper or broadside or a book. And so he brought them to Matthew Brady, who was one of the great photographers of the latter half of the 19th century. Brady was in New York and had a studio. One of the things that they would do with very early photography, daguerreotypes, tintypes, other early forms, was give them to artists and use them essentially just for the information that was contained in them. So the whole reason that Fremont wanted a daguerreotypist to come with him on the expedition wasn't to make beautiful pictures that we could email each other, but it was so that there was visual information that would be captured that was provable, that this is the route where the railroad should go. And so the only way to reproduce those images was to give them to an artist who would make a pen and ink etching out of that out of that daguerreotype. Those could then be put onto engraving plates, and the engravings could then be published. They could be reproduced. And so when you look at a Harper's magazine from the mid-19th century, and you see those sort of line drawings, that's what an etching was. And so the whole purpose of making the daguerreotypes was to essentially then turn them into these etchings. And so based on Martha Sandweiss and the other photographic historians who we interviewed for the film, the assumption that was made is that the daguerreotypes themselves were essentially expendable. They just weren't useful. They served their purpose. The etchings were made, and they were put into storage. Essentially, the equivalent at the time of what would be like a Manhattan mini storage. And there was a big fire in, I think it was 1888. I can't remember now from the film. Does anyone remember exactly what year the fire was? I think it's 1888. Many years later, that the daguerreotypes had probably been sitting in collecting dust, and there was a documented fire that burned down a huge block of Manhattan. And in the store, there was a storage unit there, and the Fremonts, Jessie, Fremont's wife, wrote in her diary that they lost a huge amount of stuff. They lost paintings, they lost family heirlooms. And so we believe that the daguerreotypes were probably most likely among those that were things that were lost. The one image that remains, that was the piece of the film that we showed, that image somehow became part of the Matthew Brady collection at the Library of Congress. So you can guess, maybe Brady kept it, maybe somebody gave it to him. This he loved. I mean, it was a particularly special one, as we talk about in the film, and Brady kept it. And in the Library of Congress, they were able to authenticate it quite a long time ago, I think in the 1920s, as not being a Brady, but as being created by Solomon Carvalho.
So, Steve, on that note, someone just asked if it's true that Brady had claimed some of the photographs as his own work.
I mean, we won't know, but certainly that one was re-authenticated. But I think I'm not sure if I mean, I think one of the things that we were hoping when we were doing the research for the film was that we would stumble upon a trove of these daguerreotypes somewhere, that they would be buried in inside another collection at Library of Congress, or they would be in somebody's basement, or they would be in a gallery somewhere, or a daguerreotype repository. And the more we looked, we never found them. And Schleyer spent a lot of time as well when he was putting his book together and doing his research to try and find them. So all the evidence sort of pointed to the fact that they were lost, and I think that was kind of assumed. So we attribute it to the fire.
And now someone else is asking about the pronunciation of his name, and my guess is that it has an original Sephardic or Spanish pronunciation and has been Anglicanized, but is it Carvalho or Carvalho?
Well, for the film, we made a decision to go with the Sephardic pronunciation. Bob Schleyer we were filming him on camera, and he and I had a conversation. I said, we got to say it one way. And he felt strongly that Carvalho would have used in the era the sort of the Sephardic pronunciation. I think other people may feel differently, that maybe he had anglicized it and they called themselves Carvalho. So I think just for the purposes of consistency, we used Carvalho in the film. But I don't know, is anybody else? Keith, what do you think?
You're on mute, Keith.
You're muted. You're muted, Keith. We can't hear you.
One of the things we did in Charleston when Steve finished the video was we had a big community event that was, it was sponsored by KKBE because of our Carvalho connection, but it was really done beautifully. And we rented a theater, we showed the documentary, we had a big reception, and people learned about Carvalho through the documentary, Carvalho's Journey. So it was wonderful working with Steve and for teaching our community all about it.
Thanks, Anita. It was such a pleasure to work with you guys, really. And the screenings in Charleston in particular were just like some of the most fun and gratifying of any of them.
Sponsored by Federation as well as the synagogue.
That's great.
And we do spend about 15 minutes of the film that we didn't show just talking about the history of Jews in Charleston. That was, right. I was working with some of my my PBS executive producers saying, oh, you should cut the film down and make it a little bit shorter. Like, well, maybe we should just cut it's an easy section. You just cut out the whole history of Jews in Charleston, but we fought for it and said, no, this is important because It's so much a part of his story, and really, it's hard to get that stuff, in other works.
After working with you, we went searching our cemetery records for our historic Cumming Street Cemetery, and we found that Emmanuel Nunez and Caroline Carvalho have a baby buried in our cemetery. And the baby died in 1813 and was named David Nunez Carvalho. So we had to sort that out because our Carvalho came along in 1850. But the baby bears that name, and the tombstone is right there in our historic cemetery.
Thank you. And Anita, Dr. Khan, did you have an answer to the question about the Jewish cemetery? I think you're on mute.
No, I didn't sit and read the article at the moment, but there is an article about the first Jewish cemetery site where Carvalho is mentioned and the founding of the Benevolent Association in the Western States Jewish History Historical Quarterly. So I can read it and get back to somebody if they're very interested in it.
Well, our Carvalhos were part of the founding of the Hebrew Benevolent Society in Charleston, which was founded in 1784. So the Carvalhos were very much a part of the fabric of the community. I do have a different question. We have the Dale's wonderful book, A Portion of the People, and we have David Camden de Leon's picture here, his portrait painted by Carvalho. So we do have this information, and I want to be sure that we have that clear in the video because there was some confusion of the label. So let's just be sure that we have it correct.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. Before we conclude, the induction and the celebration for the Jewish American Hall of Fame is not just virtual. Mel and the Jewish American Hall of Fame have been issuing commemorative medals each year for each inductee. So there are physical medals that you can reach out to Mel to order, which benefit the Jewish American Hall of Fame and its work. And he usually creates a few hundred for each year, I believe. And these are the medals that are on display at the Skirball Museum in Cincinnati and the plaques at the Virginia Holocaust Museum. And I was pleasantly surprised here in DC, where I live in DuPont Circle, when I toured the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. I saw one of the medals on display. I think it was for Asher Levy, who was a Revolutionary War hero or soldier. So the medals have made their way around the world, and they're available for order physically. And so, Mel, if you would like to just elaborate on that a little bit more and add some closing words as well, I'd like to turn it back over to you.
Hi, well, I was just blown away. You'd think we had rehearsed this many times, but all of our presenters were outstanding and covered all the aspects of Carvalho's life. I want to thank everyone for contributing their time to this effort. Just a brief commercial, and this is what the medal looks like. And this is now the longest series of medals of any kind currently being issued by the United States. So if anybody's interested for information, you can email me at directorjahf@yahoo.com. But I want to thank everybody again. It just was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mel, and I'd like to thank you again for your dedication to this work for more than 50 years. You know, in my professional life, and I'm sure many of you in your professional and personal lives, we've just been inundated with daily bad news the last month and a half, and it's just been so refreshing and heartwarming to participate today in this positive celebration to commemorate Carvalho and the contributions of Jewish Americans as a whole. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists for being a part of that and for sharing this important story, and to all of our participants for joining today. The induction ceremony hosted by the Jewish American Hall of Fame in partnership with the Combat Antisemitism Movement. It has been a true pleasure to host this induction and to add another esteemed member of the American Jewish community throughout our history to the Hall of Fame for his incredible accomplishments and lifelong dedication to discovery, art, and Jewish life in the United States. Today's program will be available this week on CAM's YouTube pages, which can then be shared in the coming days across social media platforms. And you can learn more about the Jewish American Hall of Fame at amuseum.org and the Combat Antisemitism Movement at combatantisemitism.org, or also on social media. So thanks again for being here today to celebrate the life and accomplishments of Solomon Carvalho. And please feel free to reach out as a follow-up with any questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Take care.